So this week's lecture, is going to be just a collection of modern short stories written within, I don't know, the last few decades, latter half of the 20th century for the most part. We're going to begin with Maxine Hong Kingston's No Name Woman, which I think is a very, very interesting story because it deals with, of course, family stories and secrets. All families have secrets. All families have stories. If you do a little genealogy, you go talk to your parents and grandparents, especially when you get a little older, you find out stuff you didn't know was going on in your family. Did that with my father, for example. Before he passed away, he and I spent a considerable amount of time going through family photos and identifying who was who for our family history. Came across one with my uncle during Christmas time with a lady who was not my aunt and a child who was not my cousin. And I asked my father and said, "Who is this lady with Uncle Buddy?" And he said, "Oh, I've never told you about that. That's the woman he brought home one Christmas after he left his wife and took up with her. Then they broke up later, but we didn't say anything about it because you were just a kid." And I thought, oh my gosh, scandal. And he said, "Yeah, exactly. You just took up with this lady and her child." But then he went back to his wife, and your aunt and he continued on together. Well, golly, scandal, shock, right? Every family has that. And I think Kingston is kind of doing that. It's not quite as funny in this case. Also mixed into this, the whole idea of family stories and secrets is also the fact that Kingston is, for example, a first generation immigrant family, or she's dealing with immigrant generations, parents and children, okay? Which I think is a really interesting and very American sort of story. One of our other stories is going to be a very American story. It's about who you are, right? Who you are and where do you come from and what is your identity? Who are my people, right? What is my culture? And people are very interested in that. And if you are from a family of recent immigrants in particular, it doesn't matter if you're recent or not, but especially recent immigrants, you kind of can identify with Kingston's whole issue here or theme here about how different it is between those generations. The generation that came over or came to this country versus the first generation that was brought up in the country as an American kid. Doesn't matter what country your family comes from, just about all families go through this, and the different generations view things just very differently. Your parents or grandparents, if they were born in another country, want to hang on to those things and want you to hang on to those identities, and frequently. And they have different ways of viewing things. Maxine is raised as an American, and she says, "I went to John Wayne movies, and I hung out with kids in an American school, an American high school. I always felt different. But I always felt this need to be an American, and I struggled my whole life with what that means," right? That's a difficult thing for some kid who is noticeably different from her classmates, comes from a different family. Even something from like bringing your friends home to meet your family and wondering, are they gonna accept my family? Are they going to be okay with them being different from their parents because they come from a different country and a different culture? So this is really about a culture clash, the culture clash of the old culture and the old world and the old country and the older generation versus the new world, new culture, new generation. And she's sort of shocked by the values and practices of the old country. She finds out more and more about what her parents and grandparents did and how village life was. It seems to us just terribly violent and terribly difficult and very just distressful what the village does to her aunt and to her aunt's family when her aunt finally has this child that was clearly the product of adultery. She married a man, and then he went away immediately to go find work overseas, as many of the men did during a time of famine in the country, in China. And a sufficient time went by so that it's clear that she could not have gotten pregnant from her husband on their wedding night, right? Doesn't take 12 months or 11 months for a baby to come along, or however long it's been. Nobody asks anything. There's a kind of a shunning, a silence, a sort of isolation, a punishment from that. Nobody says anything about it. They just know and they don't like it. And she actually is sent back to her own parents. Normally, as she says, it's tradition for a woman to go and live with her husband's family when they get married. Her husband's family sends her back. Why does her family take her in? She speculates a lot on that. But it leads her to ask questions. The story is basically about asking questions about who am I and where do I fit in. But to understand that, she has to understand this dark secret. She's told, don't ever ask about your aunt. Your father says, I had no sister. I had no sister. Only brothers. We don't talk about her, right? Don't ever ask about her. And so there are all these things she doesn't know about. She just knows what happens, the basics of it. So she spends a lot of the time in the short story trying to use her imagination to fill in the, well, what if? Well, was she in love with this man? Or did he force himself on her? Did she do this of her own choosing? Was she some, radical person? How did this happen? Where did it happen? When did they meet up? And all these things that you can't possibly know, but you can't help but think about and wonder about. And in doing so, she brings up what little bits and pieces she does know. The stories from the old country, her crazy grandpa who puts his private parts on a table, and traded his son for a daughter, which is an odd thing to have done. Also, the time of the famine and how serious food was and how precious it was and how you didn't joke at the dinner table. And when you passed a bowl of food to somebody, that person, out of reverence, used both hands because you didn't dare drop a thing, because that's how precious food was. Food was a serious thing. It's not something to be taken lightly. It's precious, invaluable, and you don't eat in the same way that maybe Westerners did, which is to take it kind of lightly and you drop a little, spill a little, whatever, not in a place where you've suffered hunger on the scale that they did in China in the middle of the 20th century, throughout much of the 20th century, in fact. So we get to the end of the story, and she is essentially spending some time asking deeper questions. Why does she say she's punishing her anonymous aunt as well? That's a very crucial line as we get to the end there. She says, they have made her into a non-person, even in the afterlife, because, of course, in her culture, spirits live on, and the spirits of your ancestors live on, and you leave offerings for your ancestor, but no offerings for her. She can just go hungry in the afterlife. That fits in, you see, with the famine. She was hungry in her lifetime. She will be hungry forever because none of her family will ever acknowledge her and will never give her offerings of food or anything like that. She has to go begging, and she will be shunned in the afterlife the way she's shunned at the dinner table. You have to go sit somewhere else and eat your food with, by yourself, even in the afterlife. This strikes us as just being an incredibly cruel and heartless punishment. Whoever this woman was, and she has no name. You see, her very identity is stripped away from her. You because of what you did, we don't know you. You never existed, and we don't even say your name, and we will never acknowledge you in our ceremonies honoring our ancestors, because we don't acknowledge that you are one of our ancestors. And she says towards the end there that she is also punishing her anonymous aunt. How is she doing so? That's the question I want to ask you. She kind of partly answers this. What is her aunt's punishment? It's clearly the obliteration of her memory. And she says, I am participating in that because she can ask her father, but she doesn't dare. If she asked her father, would her father tell her? I don't know. But she could, but she doesn't dare do it. So she says, I'm complicit in her anonymity because I won't ask more about her. I don't want to cross that. I don't want to go against that. It's a very interesting, very moving piece, and one that a lot of people can identify with. It's kind of an interesting thing. If your family is new to this country, and by new I mean like within the last couple of generations, from wherever, like I said, there's a struggle. There really is. The parents, that first generation, looks at the younger people and says, oh my gosh, what have we done here? They've been absorbed by this American culture and all of its negatives and all of its bad aspects. But they did it, of course, because they wanted a better life for their children. And they feel like, yeah, that's a good thing. So it's a double-edged sword to them. But for the children, it's, well, you know, I think a lot of times a lot of kids who are from immigrant families grow up kind of feeling different, of course, and are very self-conscious about that, and sometimes rather embarrassed by it. Oh, my family, we're going to come over and they're going to think my family's weird because we do these different things and we eat different food and we have different traditions and different religion and et cetera, et cetera. It's only until you get older that you begin to look back and say, gosh, as a teenager, I was such a schmuck. Why did I behave that way? Why was I that way? Why was I not prouder of who I am and where I come from? And why did I not understand and appreciate my parents' and grandparents' sacrifices? There's also a huge burden on immigrant kids. You know, their parents will tell them frequently, we gave up everything to get here. So the pressure on them is huge. So anyway, I think Kingston's short story is a fascinating piece because it is so very American in many respects, because so many people from America, not everyone, had some sort of an immigrant experience. And every person has to figure out, how do I become part of this big mosaic of the American family? And it's an interesting piece because of that. Another interesting piece that I want to get to, and we'll do a second video after this, is Alice Walker's everyday use. Now, you may remember Alice Walker from The Color Purple. If you've ever read that novel or seen that movie, it's been out for a long time. The movie has been, the novel has been as well. But it's a very famous piece of work. It's a beautiful piece. It's very sad and very disturbing in many respects, but beautifully wrought. And here's another instance where we have a short story that illustrates the importance of family and the notion of origins or roots in American literature. One of my favorite shows on PBS, I don't know if they're still doing it or not, is hosted by Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., who's a historian from Harvard, and he gets celebrities on there, and they say who, you know, it's called Finding Your Roots, and it's you know, every episode is about trying to find somebody who's famous. I wish they'd do ordinary people too, but they do famous people, celebrities and stars and writers and thinkers and philosophers and such, and they say, we're going to trace your roots. And a significant percentage of the people that he has on the show are African American. And that's really interesting. And I think he took a personal interest in it because he's African American too. Because a lot of people who are African American say, well, I don't know whether I can do much genealogy because, unfortunately, because of the legacy of slavery, the paper trail ends once you work far enough back, because people didn't keep as careful a records of births and deaths and marriages and these kinds of things when people were sadly treated like property. There might be a record of them, but there might be a very sparse record. So my friends, I'm interested in genealogy as well. My friends who are African American who are interested in genealogy call it the wall. You go back so far and then there's nothing, right? Because there's no record, there's no paper trail. And what's surprising, though, is with this show, is that he's able to go farther back than a lot of people think. A lot of African-American people think. They're like, wow, he went further back than I thought you could. Yeah, it takes some digging, but you can do it. And then the other thing is, what's fascinating is DNA technology. And you can take your DNA sample and you can determine which ethnic groups your genes are made up from. And so there are a lot of people who are African American who are really fascinated, I would be too, about, well, gosh, what parts of Africa are my people from? And there are wonderful tests that you can do it. So this whole sort of reemergence of the need to know where our families come from is very strong, and it's only gotten stronger because of DNA and the use of the internet and modern research techniques. This short story came out in 1973, though, okay? But it's still about heritage and in some way. But what I want to ask is, why isn't Dee correct about this? Doesn't she have a point? So let's go through a little bit of the setup. Here we've got probably one of the most remarkable characters in modern American fiction, Mama. We only know her as Mama, but we know who she is, and she describes herself to us, and she is this strong, powerful, assertive person who says, you know, I am not a terribly feminine woman, and I'm okay with that. Right? I don't wear high heels, and I don't polish my fingernails, and I don't walk with a dainty walk. I'm pretty big and strong and powerful, and I don't care because I'm who I am. And she's very comfortable who she is. She has two daughters, Dee, who goes by a very long name, right, in the short story, and Maggie. And they have two radically different lives. Two very different, their very demeanor demonstrates this, in fact. We begin with sort of a self-portrait of Mama. She's strong. She's this survivor. She has fantasies of glamour, but she knows they're fantasies. Okay, she knows they are. She's comfortable in who she is, even though some would say she's kind of rough around the edges and kind of countrified, but she doesn't care. It's like, I'm countrified and I don't care. We get a real sense of who she is in this amusing self-description that she provides for us. But there are several questions that we have to ask. First of all, regarding Maggie. What kind of life has Maggie had? Well, Maggie is a burn victim, right? Who really lacks any sort of self-esteem and who's used to being her sister's shadow, used to never winning anything. Or having anything reserved for her, is what Mama says. That all changes when Mama puts her foot down with Dee. She's actually shocked, Dee is, by Mama's forceful defense of her rights to the quilt. Well, I guess Maggie and Dee are probably shocked. I guess that's fair to say. They're both shocked at her response. Because, of course, Dee comes into town with a fellow who Mama nicknames Hakeem the barber, as though he's really a barber. He's not. It's just a name. Dee has renamed herself in an effort to, Wangaro is what she calls herself. And she has this new stylish boyfriend. Mama calls him Hakeem a barber. And they've embraced their African heritage and are in search of this new lifestyle that's more Afrocentric. Okay, all right. And in fact, this story was written in 1973, and that was really, really important. That was something that was happening within the African American community in the United States. This desire to, who are we as a people? What is our culture? Where are we from? And exploring that and seeking sort of these honest answers to, identity, right? Again, identity. They see these guys, though, Wangaro and Hakeem, seem to see culture as kind of a fashion statement. They see heritage and family tradition as artifacts to be preserved, right? So ask yourself this. Dee comes into the house. They're driving a fancy car. They're wearing all this chic, Afrocentric, brand new clothing that they got at probably very expensive boutiques. They come into the house, and she almost treats the house as kind of a museum. She almost treats her family as artifacts in a weird kind of way. But one artifact she seizes on is the quilt, the family quilt, which is made up of little pieces of things that every generation, all the way back, before emancipation, all the women, the mothers, the grandmothers, the great-grandmothers, the great-great-grandmothers, contributed to this quilt. And every time something would wear off, they'd replace a piece of it with something else. And these quilts are made up of scraps of clothing and dish towels and whatever it is, whatever is necessary. Back in the day, people thought, oh, these are just ugly old quilts, something poor people used. Then, of course, after a while, people began to say, you know what, this is folk art. This is valuable. I mean, some of these quilts go for hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's auction market as collectibles. Well, that's the way Dee is looking at her family heirloom, not as something that is about her origins and about her family that connects her to that link, that lineage all the way back. She sees it as a museum piece. And won't my friends love this? She wants to kind of mount it, put it up on a wall. So she wants to preserve the quilt as an artifact. Preserving the quilt will kill it. It kills it because it's a living, breathing thing that is passed from generation to generation, and the stories that go with it. And that piece right there was from your Uncle Fred's overalls. That piece right there was from my Sunday dress when I was a 4-year-old. And if she preserves it, it stops it. Do you see that? It freezes it and makes it something, an object rather than some. Hence the title, right? Everyday use. This is an object that is used every day, and its use is its value. Its continuing use is its value. It becomes a symbol of the traditions of the family, especially of the African American family, that is so essential to preserve. Don't put it under a glass case, right? You have to give it to your daughter and her daughter and her daughter, and everybody has to keep it going, you see. But that's not the way they say it. It's a living symbol of the family is what it is. But Dee wants to sort of freeze it. A double irony here is Dee's assertion that Mama and Maggie just don't understand their heritage. Oh, that's rich, right? You just don't understand. A little learning is a very dangerous thing, is the old saying, and I'm afraid Dee has a little learning, right? She doesn't have the complete picture here. Imagine the idea to go back to your parents or your mother especially and say you don't understand your heritage when she's been living her heritage and you've been buying it at a boutique trying to rediscover it. So her college education hasn't really served her terribly well. She hangs out with by the way, that kind of connects her to Good Country People and Hulga in a way, doesn't it? It's kind of interesting. Characters have something in common there. She hangs out with this intellectual, trendy crowd who think they know who they are and and they think they know their culture. But when she comes back home, it's almost insulting the way she treats her mom like a museum object. She doesn't know anything about her culture. Not really. She's studied it in a class. She's read it in a book. But she forgets the fact and loses the fact that she and her whole family, and especially her mother, have been living their heritage, right? And so anyway, we cut to the theme of the book, the short story, which I think is fairly obvious. You can phrase it in any number of different ways. Clearly, it's a work that has something to do with knowing yourself and your own cultural identity, and that cultural heritage is not an academic or an intellectual construct. It's something that's lived. It's who we are, even if we're rough around the edges. Look, everybody comes from some sort of background where you say, well, some people in my family kind of rough, not the most refined people. I think Walker is saying you need to embrace that and not hide from that, not try to cover it up. Stop being ashamed of it. Hey, I have relatives that chew tobacco, or I did anyway, a little rough around the edges. You have to take all of your heritage, not just cherry pick the parts that you find quaint or romantic or trendy. All of it, right? Ugly and rough and dirty, as well as the inspiring. The quilt, of course, is a symbol of that. So if you're familiar with Walker, she wrote The Color Purple, and we get to stand and cheer here like we do in that novel. It's really kind of a feel-good for Maggie, as Mama becomes the hero and sets things right by saying, you're not taking this quilt. It's Maggie's. You get everything in life. She never gets anything. This is who appreciates it. And of course, Dee's like, oh my gosh, Maggie, the snuff dipper. Oh my gosh. She would never appreciate this. Yes, she would. That's the irony, isn't it? She absolutely would appreciate it much more than you, because she knows that appreciating it means using it and passing it along and keeping it alive. So Mama gets touched by the Spirit of God, as she says, and really lets her have it. A fit of righteous indignation comes over her, and she just sets the world straight in doing it. And it's a wonderful moment in the short story, isn't it? Finally, as a work by a Southern writer, we did our Southern writers last time. This is also a Southern writer here. Could have easily fit in that group. I just didn't want to do more than 3 in one lecture. It stands as a sort of defense of rural African-American values and culture. A lot of African-American intellectuals at the time this was written, as I said, were turning their backs on Southern black culture in favor of Afrocentric things and ideas. They were like, that's in the past. I don't want to deal with that. I want to rediscover my past through a number of other different ways. And I think Walker's very brave in saying, wait a minute, this is also who we are. Now, it may not be who you like to think of us as being, because there is some sense that you go back home and people are living in some shotgun shack and they're walking around without any shoes on, and they look like, in my case, being Caucasian and being from the South, oh my gosh, please don't introduce my in-laws to my hillbilly relatives, right? Because we're all kind of like, oh, there's old Uncle Fred. Good Lord, what's he going to say and what's he going to look like? But it's who you are, and you need to stop that and stop being ashamed. You need to be proud of all of who you are and all of who your family are. And I think it's a really interesting piece. It's about African-American awakening to that. And she's saying, don't just go overboard with this Afrocentric thing. That's all fine and good. That connecting ourselves back to our ancestors is good, but don't forget about where you came from more recently than that. And that's not something to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of, because Mama is a survivor and an endurer of difficulties. You can never keep her down. And she understands, and she's grounded in what that heritage is. It's probably not chic or stylish to say so at that time, but that's a major reason why we like Walker, because she's honest and says, wake up, embrace all of who you are and what you are and where you come from. All right. Next, we're going to deal with pension. So that's part 2.